Okay, we are live. Welcome to the Identity Smart Week. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit that provides vendor-neutral education and resources to help organizations reduce the risk of a breach by combining identity and security strategies. Our membership consists of leading identity and security vendors, 31 of them as a matter of fact, in addition to our customer advisory board, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. I want to thank you for joining the webcast today. What does it mean to be identity smart? We'll discuss in more detail with our expert panel in a minute, but first, how did we get here? Most of the highest profile breaches making news can be traced back to a compromised identity. According to our research, 83% of organizations said remote work due to the pandemic increased the number of identities, which further increased the attack surface. In April, we partnered with the National Cybersecurity Alliance on the first ever Identity Management Day to raise awareness about the importance of securing digital identities. We had an overwhelming response from the identity and security community. Our good friends at the National Cybersecurity Alliance also host Cybersecurity Awareness Month every October. Amazingly, this is the 18th year that the NCA has used this platform to ensure organizations and individuals have the resources they need to stay safer and more secure online. But we still have work to do. The IDSA is founded on the premise that you shouldn't talk about security without talking about identity. During this last week of October, organizations are being asked to make security a priority, and we are going one step further to say that making security a priority also means making identity a priority in your security strategy. With that in mind, we are very proud to host Be Identity Smart Week as part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We hope that you have found value in the resources being shared by the IDSA and the broader community through Twitter and LinkedIn, using the hashtag BeIdentitySmart. I'd also encourage you to check out beidentitysmart.org for more resources. So now, on to the panel. We hope to make this an interactive discussion, so if you have questions for the panelists, please submit them. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Becky Archambault is the trusted identity leader at Highmark Western and Northeastern New York. She also leads the Identity Working Group for Health ISAC and founded the Western New York Identities Working Group. Before Highmark, Becky was the Global Identity and Access Management Operations Head for HSBC Bank. James Carter is the Chief Information Security Officer for Logarithm. He also directs the mission and strategic vision for the Logarithm Labs threat research, compliance research, and strategic integration teams. Prior to joining Logarithm, James served as the director of security informatics at a large nonprofit medical center in Minnesota. Carlos Garcia is a senior principal architect for Optum, founder and chair of Twin Cities Identity and Access Management Users Group and the Clinical Open Source Alliance. In addition to Optum, Carlos has worked as a solution advisor for leading identity and security companies. Welcome, panelists.
Hello.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, you guys, for being here today. So I provided a brief intro for each of you all, but I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about what your role is as it relates to identity security in your organization. Becky, why don't we get started with you?
Okay. So I pretty much look at the strategy around identity and try to anticipate, I guess, what's coming. As you said, I do a lot with HISAC. I also do some work with the Blues Association. So these are much wider. HISAC is the whole healthcare community combined. Blues Association is more around all the Blue Cross Blue Shield companies in the U.S. And what we do is share, our experiences with regard to identity. The one thing that I'm learning. Like most of my experience was in the financial sector, as you mentioned, but the past couple years I've been in the healthcare sector, and in the healthcare sector, most of my time has been spent around implementing interoperability, which are some new rules coming down, some new regs around sharing electronic health information. And then the other thing I've been dipping my toe in a little bit more that I wasn't familiar with a couple years ago is consumer identity. So again, getting familiar with both of those things, but I'm really look forward to the discussion today, and thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Becky. Carlos, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Yeah, I have about a 17-year history, kind of off and on with United Health Group within the Optum organization. In the past 4 years, I've been kind of a unique team where we get to work on major projects, such as some of the COVID efforts, or more specifically in a lot of our genomics efforts, and working a lot both within here in the States on some research programs, or also with the UK with the NHS in regards to some of their clinical genomics. And so in my role and in our group, it's quite a mix of different disciplines. So I still come on as an IAM SME, working with like API security, or both enterprise and external identities, whether patient or provider or so forth. So everything from architecture to actually developing some genomic clinical applications, using DevOps methodologies. And essentially we kind of get thrown in to help solve any complex issues that occur with some of our major initiatives.
Awesome, Carlos, thanks. James, talk a little bit about your role as a Chief Information Security Officer and how it relates to identity.
Yeah, Julie, I didn't think we were going to have such a big healthcare spin here on the panelists. So, Carlos, I'm a U of M grad, Carlson School. So a number of our folks actually, like Mike Daniels and things, work over there in your organization. Nice. Over at United Health Group and Optum. But yeah, I mean, as the Chief Security Officer at a company, I own all identity. And so if you think about it, historically, identity's been sitting in the IT budget. However, it sits in the security budget in our company. And so I own everything from the user, the machine identity, et cetera. And, privileged access management, you name it. And, one of the big initiatives that we've gone through is a big zero trust initiative, which is fully catered and centered around each of these types of identity perimeters, whether it be the machine, the user, their behaviors, the network, et cetera. And so it's really important. Identity security is at the heart of that model, and I've got oversight over that as the Chief Security Officer here.
Excellent. Excuse me. Thank you. Yes, we do have a bit of a healthcare bent here today, but hopefully the expertise that you all have in your domains will translate to other segments as well. So kind of a question, and I apologize if this one is sort of tied to a question that we've discussed, but also I'm going to add a little bit here. So I was listening to a session yesterday where the topic of the Colonial Pipeline breach came up. And it was talked a lot about in the context of a ransomware attack, which I thought was interesting. But if you trace back to what I mentioned previously, as the number of breaches that have hit the headlines recently are all tied back to a compromised identity. And which is why we are here today, right? Talking about identity in the context of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And some of the blogs that we've written on the IDSA blog have been, to be cyber smart, you have to be identity smart. So I wanted to get your perspective on that, right? That idea that, for security leaders and organizations today to be cyber smart, they really need to be identity smart. And what is it that being cyber smart means to you? So Carlos, what does be identity smart? Sorry, I said cyber smart, but I meant be identity smart. What does be identity smart mean to you in your role in your organization?
I think for me, it really means on being able to observe and identify. So, limit the amount of situations or times where you have kind of the unknown unknowns, where you don't know where you have identities, whether orphaned or just used in areas that are unmanaged. Because before you could start any sort of approach, whether it's something, going down the road of a zero trust journey, you need to start with a strong understanding of the landscape where your identities reside, to know what's that, threat landscape, and make sure that they're integrated with systems and processes where you can manage them and report on them, and being able to have some action on them. So I think one, first step is being able to identify. And once you're able to identify, you could act upon it. So for me, really being the identity smart is knowing what you have, really focusing to understand all the kind of under the covers areas where, you don't want to be surprised and find out that you have some sort of breach because, oh yeah, we didn't think of looking over there where we do have identities that are being compromised.
James, how about you? What does be identity smart mean to you?
I think you got it right.
Means.
I think you got it right, Julie, right? Be identity smart is being cyber smart. You said that as well. And so, as we talked about, all the breaches over the years have all been related to some type of compromise of identity. And for those that don't know, it's not in my background here, but I was employee 53 at a company called Mandiant. So I did about 160 different intrusion investigations over 6 years. And 99% of those had to deal with, when we found the sort of the original sort of initial compromise, was always related to something with identity. And then they would go in and compromise the rest of the identities that they didn't have, but they knew they could leverage in order to move around the environment and do what they needed to do. So, it could be a user identity, it could be a system identity, it could be an application identity. There's always a weakness or a compromise around an identity. And so if identity is the linchpin for your security program, be smart about it, treat it as critical, protect it as such, and they're the keys to everything you hold valuable as a business. So I think the identity smart really means understand the various identity profiles that you have within your organization, understand the workflows around them, understand how they're leveraged in a normal fashion, and really build programs around there to make sure that you can protect anything around those types of identities, not just user, not just system, but application, etc.
Becky, over to you. Be identity smart. Nope, looks like you're on mute. Becky, we lost you there. Let me see if I can help. Oh. Okay. Hopefully we'll get Becky back here in a second. Hey, Becky, you there? No, oh boy. This is always fun of having an online conversation.
You're still on mute, Becky.
All right. So let's shift gears and talk about this. During the Be Identity Smart Week, we highlighted a couple of key themes throughout the week, some of which you guys have touched on already as you've done introductions. Let's start with customer identity and access management. So, even before the pandemic, organizations were putting a major focus on engaging with their customers and partners online. And then, clearly the pandemic, everything sort of went online. So how can identity help balance a great user experience and some of the bigger implications of security, compliance, and privacy? Carlos, you want to speak to that one a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. With us, it's a huge, I would say, problem. It's a huge challenge in the sense that a company like United Health Group, where we have, so many different, consumer identity approaches. We have a very large pharmacy, largest HSA bank, of course, the insurance side for employer, individuals, retirement, state government, federal government. You get into our Optum services where you have consumer health services for managing health, kind of if you have diseases, kind of going through that journey, improving lifestyle services, for everything from medical store, and of course clinics. We have a lot of clinics, specialty clinics, urgent care, and so we have a vast approach to how we handle identity within that kind of consumer side. And so much of this has been through both organic and also acquisition growth. And it's one of those things where in the past, we've been an early adopter of federation as a protocol to kind of tie in that experience to try to improve it. But, I always looked at this federation as a bit of a Band-Aid that at some point you really have to get down to resolving your core identity issues in order to have that user experience really work. User experience is more than just having a seamless SSO and having those 20 redirects in the background of your screen as you go from one service to another. So it's really kind of taking it to that step of having a master identity management system for all those relationships, and really having a kind of common framework into how your different parts of the organization consume that identity, and how do they present it to the end user to really have a seamless experience as they're going through all these different relationships with the company. So it's an ongoing thing, and it's ultimately it's both something that's technology makes it a little easier with standard protocols that make the development integration a little easier. Then part of it I think is really cultural too, and really doing the hard work of picking these services and making sure that you kind of have a centralized and agreeable approach to all these different business units, which is not very easy when you have a very large organization. But I think that's the biggest challenge we have in trying to execute a strategy like that. But ultimately, for that consumer, it's going to be the best approach. It's really going to dynamically change their experience with how they interact with us and see our services.
Yeah, trust and experience, right? Those are, I think, probably the two main things. Becky, you're back.
I am. I'm so sorry.
No.
My PC freaked out for some godforsaken reason. But just to kind of answer your last question, being identity smart, like for me, it's really educating your company about identity. So not only your security teams, but your peers, your business leaders, the executives within your company, the role that identity plays. And if you can raise that awareness, you might be successful in, getting budget and doing all the things you need to do to, keep ahead of this train that's going down the tracks. And to be honest, I think one of the ways you can kind of drive the point home is, think about identity outside of the corporate world. Every time you go into an airport, you're showing ID, or a grocery store, for example, or COVID vaccination, right? You need IDs for all of those things, our everyday lives. So if you can kind of bring it back to, how identity is in their everyday lives, I think that you can, try to get people to focus on it. And not only that, but as you guys mentioned, like it's the source of most, between 80 and 90% of breaches start with identity. So you have to focus on that. So I hope that helps.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and while we have you, let's talk about customer identity and access management in your realm, right? So you're dealing a lot with patient outcomes, and I'm sure a big part of that is how do you engage with patients online and that kind of thing. So talk a little bit about customer identity and access management in your world.
Yeah, so again, I think, it's new for a lot of identity teams, customer identity and the management of it, right? So the features like, registration and self-service, consent and preference management, are huge, especially in the healthcare space right now. Offering single sign-on and multi-factor. These things are required to deliver interoperability. So, these new regs that are coming out in the healthcare world, there's a payer-to-payer API, right? A directory API, patient directory, and then a patient access API. So those are new requirements that basically, for sure, payers are expected to deliver between this year and next. And they're huge challenges. So without a really good foundational customer identity system that you can use to do a lot of this extra work, you need that to be successful. It's getting more and more important.
Yeah, James, you put on this.
I think it's interesting. I mean, it makes me reflect back on my healthcare days, but I remember identity being so important there. As a physician may have a certain identity and profile when he's at his computer checking his email, a different identity and profile whenever he goes into the operating room, an even different one when he has to order something or move into the healthcare exchange or exchange records with someone. And so there's just like such a vast array of identities. And if you think about it, getting identity right in healthcare is the difference between a doctor being able to see X number of patients and Y number of patients. So there's a huge financial benefit and process efficiency there. So that's just my tangent. So sorry, Julie, for going on a tangent, but
No, you're good.
as it relates to customer identity access management, I think we can probably even expand that to partners, at least for us, identity and access management. Obviously it's a tailored set of information that we may want to grant access to based on those rules. So we may want not to disclose certain types of information to our partners that we may want to disclose to certain customers. And then we may want to disclose certain information to a certain group of customers and not the other. And so I think, having that granularity and that control and being able to define all of that is really, really critical. And otherwise, when we started, our customer identity platform was a completely different platform. And now we're basically able to manage it all from one platform where we can manage the customer identity, understand their roles, their responsibilities within within our forums or whatever they're accessing, our community, understand what the partners need and all the workflows that they have. And so, with that understanding and with that granular set of controls and the centralized management of it, you've got management, protection, traceability of that person identity from a security perspective. Oftentimes we're sitting with, if we want to give access to documents or a community, it's either wide open or completely closed off. And so I think this allows us to really tailor the customer experience, not just have the security benefits, but the customer experience being tailored to what their needs are and what they might be interested in, whether they're in a certain industry, whether they work for a partner, et cetera.
Yeah, very important. It seems to me that organizations are still managing identity in silos to a certain extent, right? Not thinking about all of the identities within the organization. And so, we talked about a little bit about machine identities. And so some people suggest that the number of machine identities in an organization has actually surpassed the number of human identities. And so, James, I'll start with you. Based on your experience, you think that is actually the case? Yeah. And what are the risks and challenges that have been created and best practices to address them? So machine identity is a huge problem these days, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think 100% it is surpassed, the human identity as it relates to that. I mean, the number of machines or systems that a company uses greatly outnumbers the number of employees they have. So as an example, I have two identities at my company, a regular user and I have an admin user or super user identity that's tied to me. But I have a laptop, an iPad, both machine identities. I have a mobile phone as a machine identity. I have a number of VMs installed on my laptop, which each has a machine identity in itself. And then you think about systems and applications, microservices, APIs that a single identity might access. And so 100% machine identities have greatly surpassed the number of human identities. I think we've gotten better about machine sprawl in a way, but I still think it outpaces human identities when you think about all the things that would constitute a machine identity. So I think the first thing we have to do is understand that a machine is an identity type. And I think everybody just tries to say identity means user when identity can mean machine as well. And then we have to protect it like we do human identities. We need to protect the machine identities in the same way. We onboard and offboard users. We perform move, add, change for users. When someone leaves the company, they're removed from our systems. We remove them from our payroll. We need to do a lot of that same sort of rigor around the machine identity as well.
Yeah, Carlos, machine identities. What's your perspective? What are the challenges and how do you address them? What are some best practices from your side?
Yeah, no, a lot of it is that ownership, and also it's having an understanding of what machine identity is, because exactly as James was mentioning, it's like, I have a laptop, that's a machine identity, but take it further, and it really comes down to within its processes too. I mean, it's drilling down to what is something that can act upon a system. And so if you look at, the Unix world, you have like, okay, well, that Unix server has an identity. Actually, it has a bunch of them, because each process that has the ability to act and do something needs to be tied to an individual that owns the control that it has. And so really it's going down to that granular level of being able to identify that, within this service, within the server, all these different services are running under different identities, and what are they doing? What are the limitation, and who's ultimately the one that's attesting to the requirement for that to be there, and making sure that it's doing the minimum amount that it needs to do. And so that's hard work, because one, you have to be able to track all that, and two, you have to assign ownership. And I think in the past, it's something that hasn't been owned. It's always been like, well, that's a server, it belongs to the server group. And it's like, no, I think at some point there is some responsibility that, individuals, or small group of individuals have to own, to make sure that, do we need to run all these default processes on the server? What vulnerabilities are they adding by having them there? Or if we need to run them, how do we mitigate? So understanding the scope of those machine identities and what it means. And then that explodes when you get into microservices, because on one hand, it's like, oh, great, I don't have to use servers. I'm going to use these smaller, processes to do exactly what I need to. But, the amount of microservices that you start creating, because it's so easy to create and they're so small and lightweight, again, you have an additional explosion there. And it's really, it goes back to, what does it mean to be identity smart, right? It's to be able to identify that all of these are points of identity and points of security concern that you just need to be able to track. Step one is know what's out there, and not have this like, oh, I never thought of that's an identity I need to worry about. And one is understanding the scope of how many identities you have out there is the first step in being able to solve it, is to know what your problem statement is.
Yeah, Becky, anything to add here? And then we actually have a question that came in on this topic, which I'll get to in a minute.
No, I think I think they covered it. And the bottom line is, you have to treat them like human identities. So you have to really define the differences between machine identities. Again, their devices, their mobile devices, their VMs, and then there are also containers and applications and functions, right, and services. So getting owners is, as you guys mentioned, is the hard part. And certainly those of us that have been in the workforce identity side for a long time know that, that alone is hard. It's hard to get people to step up and own. And once you own, you have to attest regularly, this is the right access. It's a fair amount of work, but it's definitely necessary.
Yeah, so this idea of identifying an owner for a machine versus a non-person, identifying an owner for a machine or non-person accounts and associated identities. So how do you do that? Do you guys have any best practices on how? That was a question that came in. Thank you for that. I don't know, James, you talked about owning machines, or I don't know, Becky, maybe you have a perspective on that, but how does that work?
So there's a lot of different kind of discovery tools out there that you can make use of. There's not one size fits all, right? Because there's certainly, there's endpoints. There's a lot of these not these machine identities are privileged, right? So they might sit in the cloud and be running some of your cloud infrastructure, your entitlements. So it's really important that you start to pay attention to, what you can't manage, what you don't know about. So the discovery of those things is, more than a small piece of work, I would say. And that's probably where I would start. And the other thing I would say is each identity needs to be unique. So each VM needs to be unique, each laptop, each, mobile phone, there has to be some uniqueness defined to every single one of those components. And again, that isn't always, first of mind.
Yeah, I think what I would add too is I think Becky touched on the discovery aspect of number of tools to be able to identify the various machine types that you have. We know that's not the foolproof method, and we know that most organizations are really bad at having the inventory of their machine types and things like that. Usually, it's like one of the top things to do, and everybody does it very poorly. And then as far as like ownership is concerned, though. Yes, each machine ID should be unique. Yes, there should be certain restrictions and processes and controls and workflow and normalized behavior from machine ID to wherever it's communicating to. But ultimately, too, as far as ownership is concerned, you can still tie back machine IDs to a person or an organization. And I think, even with, microservices infrastructure, even with machine identities that are leveraged a lot in DevOps type things, the SRE organization owns quite a bit of that. As far as managing all that and being able to see all that, they know that this VM is tied back to me. They know my mobile phone's tied back to me. And so, yes, machine identities are unique and they need to stand alone themselves. Obviously, being a zero trust guy, I believe in that. And so there has to be tailored controls based around that. But as far as just understanding ownership of it, it still can be tied back to an individual.
Yeah.
I'll add to that. In addition, it's also ultimately who owns it is the business that runs that application. I mean, the way we kind of tackle it is that for any application that goes into production or even non-prod, any piece of infrastructure that's provisioned, it's like, who is this for? And we have kind of like almost like an application database service or an application service that tracks, because both from outside of the identity issue, just from a financial, from a tracking, from a operational, if this server goes down, who does it affect? Being able to say that this business application encompasses these IT services, and what are those IT services? And from that point of view, the ownership of like, well, this VM runs for you, ultimately you own it. And so as a starting point of trying to tie, because yes, the discovery tools are great for discovering, but it doesn't create that relationship to say, well, you discover this identity, but who owns it? A starting point is basically, the business that requires that service to run has some ownership of it. And there you get into the nuance there, of course, because you have managed services and teams that are doing managed applications for businesses to consume, and service providers also own some of that. So it becomes a nuanced answer, but ultimately, the owner of that infrastructure is the one that's either deploying an application within it that's using that infrastructure for some service, or that's offering a service that others consume within it. There is the ability to track down, who the owner is. I think you just need to kind of have that overarching application ownership kind of from the start. That's something that we've had over years. So as we drilled further down into this kind of concept of making sure that we identify all these identities, we have that strong foundation, at least, that we could start kind of funneling down to, well, we know who owns this, we know what service manages this, and start going after people to say, we think you own this, you convince us otherwise you don't, but someone does.
All right. Okay, Carlos, and thank you for that question, by the way. And if anybody has any questions for the panelists, please submit them through the comment section. As I mentioned at the start, I'd love to make this interactive. So Carlos, I want to stay with you and talk a little bit about today's theme, which is applying identity to DevSecOps processes and tools. The adoption of DevOps, you talked a little bit about, created significant benefits, but also a lot of security risks. There are more services, applications, and tools that need protection than traditional environments. So talk about, and you're also a part of the DevSecOps technical working group, which I appreciate. Talk a little bit just about the, what the organizations out there should be focusing on when it comes to DevSecOps, and how does identity intersect with those processes and tools?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And coming from the identity world and now becoming, a practitioner of kind of the DevOps, kind of way of working, if you will. It's been really interesting to kind of see kind of some of the blind spots, or at least the way that there's probably some level of identity being siloed, maybe is the way I want to look at it. Because you think of DevOps, it's really to combination of obviously development and operations, and really having teams go everything from nothing to build out and to deploy a service within a cloud-based architecture, let's say a cloud-based infrastructure. And when you think of how you build something on-prem, you're deploying VMs, and there is usually an operations team that's building those VMs. They might own those identities. In a cloud environment, in a DevOps environment, your development team is building that infrastructure. What do they have as best practices around making sure that they're not building their infrastructure unsecurely, that making sure that those machines' identity are secure? And so that requirement, I think, is that identity teams or kind of services teams needs to build bridges and have more conversations with those DevOps teams. And again, it's like, how are you managing identities? Do you realize these are identities that you're creating through your microservices when you're deploying infrastructure as code, within an Azure or an AWS environment? You're creating a bunch of identities. Are you locking them down? Are you able to observe them? Often the identity team and the cloud enablement team might be two different groups that don't necessarily talk to each other. So really kind of creating those bridges and those conversations to make sure that you collaborate. And as the IAM team, create templates, sample code. Don't be the team that's like, no, it's more of a, of course, yes, and this is how, and let us create these repeatable processes for you. I mean, within our organization, we have a bunch of, we happen to use Terraform. We have a lot of kind of Terraform sample templates, if you will, to help development teams build things right from the start. And so really kind of working with a security point of view and identity point of view to, from the start, being able to codify this kind of zero trust notion, it's a great starting point. And I think that takes collaboration. And it's really collaboration and really understanding what they're doing. So it's really having the mindset of, let me help you enable you by making things easier for you, while at the same time making them secure based on some of the best practices that we have.
Yeah, enabling, not a normal perspective from security, right? I think that security gets the bad name in that it puts up barriers or the no.
Right. Yeah. It's not helpful to go in and say, well, you did everything wrong. Look at all these things you did wrong, and then be like, go fix it. From the development point of view, it's like, well, what are, you tell me what you need it to be. It's way better to come at it and be like, hey, look, we have some examples. Why don't you follow these templates? Because they've already kind of codified as, some of these best practices. So build upon this. Oh, you just saved me a ton of work. Yeah, sure. I could use this as a foundation. So it's like, you're enabling, you're helping, you're saving them time. And on your side, you're ensuring some commonality on how a lot of your microservices or your DevOps, process is being deployed. You have some sense of like, great, everybody's kind of building these similar patterns. So we feel that, our landscape is being, controlled a little better.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on DevSecOps and the role of identity in those processes and tool sets?
Yeah, I mean, Carlos covered it fairly well, but I'm happy to just chime in too. And I joke around a bit about being a security leader and how many times I get like sort of these are the droids you're looking for, where DevOps infrastructure as code. And that seems to be the answer. And I'm like, well, we still got to do it securely as well. But, if you look at, just the advantages of DevOps, right? Spinning up and spinning down systems and microservices, scalability, the dynamic nature of it, automation, the ability to do things really fast in a repeatable fashion. But there's also those natural inherent security benefits of it. Like as an example, if you've got a whole litany of microservices and all of a sudden a microservice changes randomly or has something there that's just different, a new file, whatever the case is, you can literally automate shutting down that microservice and spinning up a new one to replace it. That's, from like a gold image style microservice image. So that in itself is a big security benefit, because it's like, all right, some attacker goes and compromises the microservices. Oh, microservice is gone. Up comes a new one. No longer dealing with that same attacker anymore. You can just do that repeatedly, and I think that's like one of the inherent benefits of DevOps that a lot of like security practitioners don't think about. Now, trying to get forensic evidence that sits long enough when that stuff happens is a whole other problem. We can have probably a whole other webinar on. So, but even all of that being said, I think Carlos said it well. Like even with the DevOps kind of motion, it's all still tied to identities, machines, microservices, humans, etc. So it's still part and parcel with DevOps as well.
Okay, so we do have another question. I'm going to read this one because it's got some context behind it. But a recent SC Magazine article around healthcare access highlighted an eye-opening stat. One of the more notable findings revealed that just 41% of healthcare and pharmaceutical organizations have a comprehensive inventory of all third parties with access to the enterprise network. So this is kind of back to a little bit of our customer identity and access management discussion previous. To the panel, why do you think only 41% of these orgs have this inventory in place? And second, what do you do with the knowledge / inventory once you have it? Anybody want to tackle that one? So talking about third-party access.
Yeah, I could. It's a big enough area or a big enough issue within our organization that we actually have a very specific team to handle that. So from that point of view, there's not so much I could speak of other than having onboarded a vendor, let's say, and having gone through the process of there's definitely a lot of analysis and security review, both contractual and just, looking at what's going to happen, what's the reviewing very carefully the controls around how this integration is going to occur, and tracking, again, the identities associated with that relationship and kind of the communication pipes. And also, what does that third-party access look like? We offer a third-party integration communications gateway that we prefer to go through. So again, we have more of a control with a third party that it's a common gateway. So that interesting article, I haven't seen it. I'll have to kind of look it up. But I feel that certainly it's definitely a major area. And it's definitely something that I think we take very seriously. And I would imagine that a lot of it has to do, the issue, at least I would guess that the article speaks to, is within any large organization, you have a lot of businesses that have autonomy to do integration. And if they don't have a strong centralized governance or centralized kind of security apparatus where you have to go through an onboarding process as part of the business review, and not even just an IT review, where the business does something and then IT is trying to like, oh, you already signed the contract, now we're kind of rushing, or it's shadow IT. But at the business kind of legally point of view, when you're bringing in a vendor, in order to pay them, you have to go through some financial agreement. At that point, tracking that and being able to look into that vulnerability from that point on, I think is part of our approach.
Maybe I'll jump in because I worked for a large healthcare organization, and 100% that survey, I'm surprised it's actually even 41%. I actually think it should be a lot less than that. I mean, the complexity of managing identities in a healthcare setting. So my last organization, we had a clinical arm, we had a research arm, we had a full-fledged university education arm. We had researchers coming in from foreign countries all over the world every 2 weeks. They might be on a 2-week rotation, 4-week, 8-week, whatever. They're in, they're out, they're bringing their own laptops in. You've got grants that are being leveraged by the government in these closed off parts of the network that you can't have visibility into. You've got just tons and tons of complexity as it relates to that. And you have an entire infrastructure of things that have to support on the B2B side as well, whether it be the hotels. I mean, we had a farm, we had an airport, we had a bank, we had hotels. We have all these things that, and the list can go on and on. And most people are like, that is weird and crazy. But it is all about doing that to provide the best possible care to the customer. So, one of the kings in the Middle East wanted to land a 747 at the airport there locally. Wasn't big enough. He built and extended the runway and then donated it to our organization, the entire airport. So we had to manage that. And so the complexity of it is just real hard in healthcare. And so I 100% agree with the survey. I'm surprised it's only 41%. I think it actually probably closer to 20% at best, but there's a lot of complexity in healthcare, and that's why.
Yeah, and I'd agree. Like third-party risk by itself is huge, complex set of processes. And again, the fact that they all might use some kind of different authentication, or you know what I mean. They're all meeting different regs. They're all different. How are they performing in security assessments, things like that. So it's huge considerations. And I think 41% is probably high, to be honest.
Yeah, and so I mean, third party means a lot of things, but at least in healthcare, specifically around things like research, where James, you kind of mentioned, you have researchers come in and they're getting access to, de-identified health records, nonetheless, still very sensitive information. And I know that there is some efforts, kind of similar to the financial OIDC frameworks that were established. We are working on some around healthcare, and specifically around research by the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, kind of doing similar things with OIDC patterns to kind of create ways to access third party for authorization, and especially for authorization into some of that data, to be able to have a better handle on it. And that's just one example of one area. I mean, third party means a lot more than that, but in some areas there are some efforts that are being followed to try to improve that.
Yeah, healthcare, obviously we're very specific in that industry, but just with this discussion today, by virtue of your backgrounds, but the complexity there, I would think, and the challenges that you guys have are easily extended to any business, right? I mean, you guys are going to have the most complex, but certainly the topics we're hitting on today, I think, are applicable to anyone. So last theme for the week is tomorrow, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning. So as we all know, it's sort of creeped into every aspect of our lives, some good and some not so good. How do you think AI and ML can improve identity insights, and what impact will it have on security and user experience? Becky, you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah. So I think, if you watch Netflix, for example, right, you are seeing kind of, AI and ML in action, right? So, it knows, what your preferences are. It presents them to you. I think they say like 80% of the shows that you watch are coming from these algorithms. So again, it's something that they have like explicit and implicit kind of data tied to it. If you give something a thumbs up, that's like a explicit reference. And if you just maybe watch the whole series of something, that's kind of implicit, like you like that topic. So I mean, this stuff is happening all over the place. And I think, as long as you can deploy it in a way that's, it's being used for the right reasons with the right resources, I think it can be really, a good thing. For identity, one of the things that I think it can be really good for is this whole idea of, RBAC, or role-based access control. I think most of us who have been in this industry for a while know that while it seemed like a great idea at the beginning, where we can tie all the people that work in HR, for example, put them in a group and, provision their access really easily, they get it fast and it's good. But what we found is a lot of those people aren't using the access or don't need it. So, things like, machine learning, they can look at that, they can monitor the usage of all those entitlements and those attributes and say, do these people really need this stuff? And start to take it away from people that don't need it, right? And that whole concept of least privilege. So, machine learning, I think, is a really good thing. I think we're seeing it more and more. It probably isn't, always the best for, processes that aren't mature. Like I wouldn't even think about it. So, again, I think it can help us automate a lot of the things that we do that are painful in the identity space. But I think it has to be the right process for it to work well.
James.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we could never have a webinar without having some conversation about AI and ML, and that's always a hot button topic for me because I think it's just such a misunderstood thing where there's ML with automation, but how far are we down the AI path? And if I have vendors coming and talk to me and talking about AI, I start twitching in the room. So there's definitely good and bad, right? I think probably a far-fetched bad case is, they came out with these AI judges that basically learn the algorithms based on the biases of the people that trained it. And so they started making decisions and still having the issue of putting innocent people in jail because those biases were inherently put into the machine. And so the same outcomes happened. And so one can say that means like, wow, that's really human-like. Then there's lots of errors and things. But the other thing is like, we're not actually fixing the problem. So, and so when I think about that, that's probably the far side of the negative side. But at the end of the day, too, through automation and insights and the speed and scale, there's just so much that AI could bring to us that is a benefit, and it is treated as, we would treat it as another identity. Now, will we call it a human identity or a machine identity? I think that's a whole other probably conversation we could have. But at the end of the day, it's still another identity type that we still have to protect against and manage and control and understand the workflow and processes of, and treat it like a machine or human identity in itself. And so, the dynamic nature of AI is supposed to match the dynamic nature of human behaviors, and we'll need to ensure that it's secure without impacting the user or AI experience.
Yeah, good. It is definitely an interesting topic, and I think just learning and understanding common behaviors of users, and then being able to apply that common behavior to an anomalous behavior, it seems like that is, that's an interesting area where identity intersects with it, to be able to understand, this isn't what this person normally does, so maybe we should flag them, and there might be a risk and a security threat there. So just one example, I think, of where things are going, and some even the technologies out there today that are being deployed. So we are getting close to the end. If anybody has any questions for the panel, please submit them through the comment section. So let's talk about identity-centric security programs. James, you touched a little bit on Zero Trust, but what recommendations would you have for your peers who are interested in starting up an identity-centric security program in their organization?
Go do it now if you haven't. I think that's probably the number one recommendation I would say. But we've touched on it throughout this, but really understanding all your identity types, mapping out all the characteristics of each of those types and workflows between identities. So it's not just human to machine to application, but machine to machine, application to application. Understand the identities you have first, and that's really the building blocks for anything that you're going to build. And that's how you really gather the requirements of how you're going to govern identities within your company, and build this program, is leveraging all of that and understanding all the workflows and all the different identity types that you have. And so I think that's where it all first starts. And then I think looking at it through, taking a zero trust approach as it relates to identities and moving that to that model to protect your company, I think that's the next logical step. So understand the workflows, understand the identity types, understand the behaviors, the controls, the risks, model it in a zero trust fashion. But I think that's probably a good starting block. But I think the ultimate thing is go get started if you haven't already.
Carlos, you want to tackle that one? Any recommendations around identity-centric security programs?
No, I don't know if you could add too much more of what James said, because I agree. I mean, step one is identify it. And once you've identified, assume you missed a lot of things and keep looking. And I think part of it is also, again, I think part of it is also the human part of it. So that culture within the organization of this being treated as something where it's a collaborative effort across different teams, and not this kind of like, let's try to get some stuff done. Because if we do it our way and the security finds out, they're going to stop this business process, so it's always coming at it from a point of view of yes, but, or yes, and, right? Yes, you're trying to do this. We get it. It's important for your business. Let's help you do it. But let's make it more secure. Let us help you. Let us give you examples. Let us, make this safer for you to do. And I think building those bridges and having that culture of not being worried about security finding out what you're doing, it kind of helps with the notion of the business coming to security and be like, hey, we want to do this, and help us make sure we do it right from the start. And I think that takes time, and it's a cultural change, but that makes it easier than, when you're going out there trying to find these identity silos, these hidden identities. It's going to make it easier when you kind of have that positive interaction with the businesses.
Becky, recommendations around identity-centric security programs.
I think, I would maybe concentrate on why I think that many times they fail, and for me, it is that culture, Carlos, that you touched on, not having executive support is key in not being able to deliver, a solid identity approach. You need funding. This is a care and feeding, sustainable organization that needs constant, continuous improvement and tools and whatnot because the scope keeps changing. You need to be able to communicate value. So similar, Carlos, to what you just said is like, how does this help you, business? What does this foundation, where is it going to get you? And then if people don't understand identity and the depth that it has and the impact it has if it's not there, you mentioned earlier, some of these breaches, the pipeline breach, that's what happens when you don't have a good identity program. So I think you need to think about, what happens if it's not there, and then it maybe will gain a little more importance.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so I appreciate your time today and all the contributions the three of you make to the Identity Defined Security Alliance. If you haven't already, please check out beidentitysmart.org. There are a number of great resources that have been published, both from the IDSA as well as from other identity management champions that are participating in Be Identity Smart Week. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I want to thank our panelists. And just remember, to be cyber smart, you need to be identity smart. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Julie.
Thanks all.